In the first reading today from Romans, Paul says a lot while saying very little, which is surprising because usually it's the opposite for him. But he attempts to address the realities of suffering, which is a pretty intense and complicated topic by anyone's reckoning, and he tries to do so in just a few verses. Now, suffering is one of those things that theologians have been trying to understand and explain for centuries. People have done their best to answer these unanswerable questions, like why do bad things happen? Why does evil exist? Why is there suffering in the world? And it's a topic that has captivated my interest ever since I started seminary. I spent most of the summer where I was working as a chaplain at a hospital diving into the subject. I read books, I talked with my advisor, I reflected on conversations with patients, and I went from having very few answers to having too many answers, and all of them still pretty unsatisfying. I continued this quest for understanding in my final year of seminary when I took a class called God, Suffering, and Evil, which actually ended up being my favorite class out of all the ones that I took. Every week, we would read a book by a different theologian, and we'd pick apart and analyze their explanation for all this, and I loved it. And even now, I'm reading a book entitled Beautiful and Terrible Things, A Christian Struggle with Suffering, Grief, and Hope. Just some light poolside reading material. But that being said, I have found that some of the most poignant perspectives on this matter do involve a little bit of humor. One of my favorites was this sign that I saw online. I'll need to soften the language for use in this context. But essentially it said, everything happens for a reason, but sometimes that reason is that we're dumb and we make bad decisions. Now, if that ain't the truth, I don't know what is. But I feel like there's probably more to be learned from Paul's take on this matter. Now, before I get too far into all of this, let me say that there are a million ways to understand suffering. Countless attempts to explain its purpose, why it happens, who, if anyone, is to blame, what our response to it should be, and I am only going to be able to begin to scratch the surface of all that today. Sadly, there is no blanket statement, no one explanation that fits every possible situation when it comes to suffering, not even Paul's theory. They all have faults. They all have flaws and fall short, so please don't take what I'm about to say as the whole truth. But if talking about those other ways of understanding suffering is something that interests you, I would love to have that conversation. But for now, Paul's line of thinking is essentially the same as Kelly Clarkson's. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. His belief is that suffering, enduring hardships, overcoming obstacles, these things all lead to growth. They all help us cultivate resilience and prepare us to take on the challenges of life. He says that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and that character in turn produces hope, and hope does not disappoint. He believes that our suffering will eventually make us into better and stronger people. The song Dancing Through Life from the musical Wicked always comes to mind whenever I think about this topic. It's sung by a guy named Fiyero, who's the love interest of the main character Elphaba, and everything in life has come easy for him. He's never had to work hard or struggle. He doesn't hear the word no very often. And if he ever does encounter an obstacle or a situation that can't easily be solved, well, it's probably not worth his time anyway. He, as the song would indicate, dances through life effortlessly, not even really, trying or caring. And what does that lack of adversity, that lack of struggle or challenge result in? It results in a spoiled, stuck-up jerk who runs away at the first sign of difficulty. There's something to be said about the kind of people that the adversities we face make us into. As many of you know, I have an autoimmune-related disease called ulcerative colitis. I'm quite open with that fact, probably more so than some people would prefer. This might surprise you, but not everybody finds the topic of which colonoscopy prep you were prescribed to be as riveting as I do. I'm pretty sure I could qualify to be a sommelier for them at this point. But I bring all this up because a few weeks ago, Pastor Laura was workshopping the discussion questions that she wanted to use with the women's retreat, and one of them was a two-part question. The first part was, if you could wave a magic wand and change one aspect of your life, what would you change? And conversely, what about your life would you never change? And my immediate answer to the first question was that I would get rid of the ulcerative colitis. But then as I pondered the second half of the question, I began to wonder what that would do to who I am as a person. Because despite the downsides, and there are many, it has made me into a more resilient person, a stronger person. It's given me unique perspectives on life that I wouldn't have otherwise, made me more empathetic to those who have to navigate the maze that is our medical system, and don't even get me started on insurance. Without the ulcerative colitis, I wouldn't have any of those things. So in addition to it being the one thing that I would magically change if I could, it was also the one thing that I would never change. And the same was true for Pastor Laura. Not ulcerative colitis, but her answer was the same for both questions as well. And we found it fascinating that that was the case for both of us. That the biggest obstacle, struggle, source of suffering was also something that had helped forge us into who we are in ways that neither of us were eager to let go of. That, as Paul said, our suffering had indeed produced endurance and character and hope. Now, I will caution all of this, saying that there is the danger that this perspective can cause some people to begin glorifying suffering, to believe that suffering is something that should be sought out, because it makes us stronger. And that can be a very dangerous mindset, and it can lead people into unnecessary suffering, either because they seek it out or because they choose to remain in a situation that is causing them pain and grief in the hopes that, enduring will make them into a better person. But that's not what Paul was getting at with all of this. Despite everything that he said about boasting, I don't think that this was meant to glorify the suffering that we experience in life, but rather it was his attempt to make the most out of an inevitability. He knew that simply being human would mean experiencing suffering from time to time, and there was certainly no need to go looking for it, because especially as a Christian living at that time, it was bound to find you. So since it was an inescapable reality, Paul wanted to give us the tools to be able to, deal with it, to give us hope and help us make the most of a not so great situation. To, as the old saying goes, make lemonade when life hands you lemons. Because so often in life, we don't have control over the adversities that come our way. We don't have control over what we experience in life, but what we do have control over is how we respond to those things. I don't get to decide whether or not I have ulcerative colitis. It's just a fact. But what I can decide is how I act given that fact. Each and every one of us can use the suffering that life has thrown our way for good or for ill. We can use it to justify rude and selfish behavior, to tell ourselves that because the world has dealt us a bum hand, that it's all right for us to take it out on everyone else. Or we can take what life hands us and make something better out of it. Whether that's for ourselves in becoming stronger, more resilient people, or whether it's for others, becoming a comforter or an advocate for those who are enduring the same thing. And that doesn't turn that suffering into a good thing. And it certainly doesn't justify the actions that caused the situation, but it does mean claiming agency and control over the things we can, and making the most out of what we are given. I love the quote from the TV show This Is Us that says, "There's no lemon so sour that you can't make something resembling lemonade," because it embodies this way of thinking. But it's also, a healthy twist on the original phrase, because like it or not, we're not always going to be able to make delicious lemonade out of the lemons that life hands us. Some of those super sour lemons aren't going to taste sweet no matter what we do. But we sure as heck can make something that at least resembles lemonade, even if it's just 6 lemon wedges and a few packets of sugar mixed into a glass of water, like my grandpa used to make because he was too cheap to pay for real lemonade. Now, I also want to acknowledge the fact that not everyone experiences the same situation in the same way. 2 people can respond to the same stimulus in very different ways. I heard a phrase during the pandemic that really brought this to mind, and it says, "The boiling water that hardens an egg is the same thing that softens a potato," which is to say that we are all different. And while certain kind of adversity might make one person stronger, for another, that might not be the case, and that's okay. That's one of the holes in this way of thinking about suffering. And I'll also say that this theory of Paul's doesn't hold up as well when we start talking about more radical forms of suffering. The Holocaust, the unbearable tragedies of school shootings, the things that just absolutely break your heart, and you wonder, how in the world could a person who is forced to endure those things come out a stronger, better person? And it's in these situations that we need to turn not to Paul, but to God for comfort and guidance. You'll notice that Paul doesn't try to explain the source of the suffering or even the reason for it. He doesn't postulate that it's God testing us or that these difficulties were sent with the purpose of toughening us up, because he knows that's not God's role in all of this. That's not how God works. God is not the cause of the suffering we experience, but rather is the greatest source of comfort and support that we can have in the midst of those experiences. Because we have a God who walks with us, who knows what it means to be human, knows what it means to suffer, and chooses to come alongside us. Today is Trinity Sunday, a day when we contemplate the wonder and mystery of what it means to have a triune God. And while most attempts to explain the Trinity wind up going in circles, one thing that we know for sure is that it means we have a relational God. We have a God who seeks after us, who does whatever is needed to accompany us through life. A God who would act as loving parent, gracious creator, and seek to provide for all of our needs. A God who loves us so much that God would become human in the person of Jesus just to restore a broken relationship between us. A God who would suffer death on the cross so that we might know that the powers of sin and death and suffering do not get the final word. A God who would come to us in the Holy Spirit to lead and guide and surround us with that divine presence, that divine love, so that we might know that we are never alone. One God, 3 persons, each one dedicated to shepherding us through the trials and tribulations of this life. Each one dedicated to helping us grow when we face the inevitable adversities that come with being human. And each one holding us and supporting us and loving us through those things that surpass what anyone would consider character-building forms of suffering. So whatever you are going through, please know that you are not alone. God is right there walking by your side. For it is God who accompanies us on that journey from suffering to endurance, and endurance to character, and from character to hope. It's God who sustains and uplifts us, who helps transform those crucifixion moments into beautiful resurrection dawns. And ultimately, it is God who never disappoints. Amen.